Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the 2022 30 by 30 conference. My name is Cassandra Polyzoo, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm a cisgendered, able-bodied woman, and also the manager for equity, diversity, and inclusion at Engineers Canada. I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded lands of the Omama-Winninewag and Anishinaabe peoples, and I recognize that I am a visitor on these lands. I also want to send out a big thank you to Elder Campiu from Driftpile First Nation of Alberta, who opened our session last week with a beautiful prayer. I'm excited to welcome you to this interactive workshop on intersectionality today. I will soon hand it over to Yasmin Tanachan Blacklock, our Associate Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, to begin with a land acknowledgement and to go over the tech and expectations for the day. Yasmin has been an incredible part of our team since last May. She has brought her experience in anti-oppression education, political advocacy, feminist international defense and security, and LGBTQIA+ healthcare to our 30 by 30 initiative. And I'm sure many of you have gotten a chance to get her emails or speak to her directly. She holds a bachelor degree in political studies and gender studies and a master's degree in political science on the epistemic shifts of Western Muslim feminism in response to 9/11. Lots of interesting stuff. Yasmin, over to you.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Cassandra. My name is Yasmin Tanachan Blacklock. My pronouns are she, her. I am the daughter of 2 migrants to what we now call Canada, and I live uninvited on the unceded territory of the Omama-Winninewag and Anishinaabe, and I directly benefit from the settling that we now call Canada. From Coast Salish territory to the Mi'kmaq to the Inuit Nuigat, I acknowledge the ancestral, the traditional, the protected, the unsurrendered, and the unceded territories of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. Today, this land acknowledgement and our topic of intersectionality compel me to share a commitment for other folks like myself who are not Indigenous. That commitment is to ensure that we are imagining indigeneity complexly. The umbrella term, we say Indigenous, covers thousands of languages, traditions, tribes, lands, bands, nations, cultures, and peoples, and the experiences of being Indigenous vary greatly, and every single one of those experiences are valid and important for us to think about. Getting into the practice of imagining Indigenous people complexly, challenging this idea of a monolith, is really beneficial because eventually you're no longer imagining complexly, but instead recognizing reality. A really great primer, specifically for recognizing the diversity of experience that falls under the label of Indigenous women, is a book called Making Space for Indigenous Feminism, written by so many wonderful authors, all who have their own understandings of what it means to be both Indigenous and a woman. Today's session is a really great way of getting this ball rolling and to start this interruption of single story narratives. Before handing it over to our next speaker, I am just going to go over some tech tips for the day. Today's speakers and panelists will be speaking in English. However, there is simultaneous interpretation available in French. The instructions on how to access the interpretation are currently shown on the screen. Closed captioning in English is also available today and can be accessed using the closed captioning button in your Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. We ask you mute your microphone to avoid any interruptions during the session. Should you encounter any technical problems during the session, tech support is available in the chat. Please message Jake Wilson in the participant list for support. If at any time today you have any questions for our speakers, we invite you to message them directly or to put them in the chat addressed to me, Yasmin Tanachan Blacklock, or Cassandra Polyzoo. Both myself and Cassandra will be monitoring the chat throughout the day if you need any other types of support as well. We understand that folks have a variety of responsibilities throughout the day, so if you need to step away, please don't hesitate to do so. Because this is a very interactive session, we ask that you use the Be Right Back reaction, which you can find in the reaction button on the toolbar on the bottom of your screen. Please note you have to click it again to turn it off, so 1 click on, 1 click off. We'd also like to remind you of the resources package provided to you for the conference, including the conference expectations. We remind everybody to approach this session with empathy, with understanding, respect, and kindness for your community and for yourself. To introduce our workshop facilitators, please welcome Jeanette Southwood, Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Engineers Canada.
Thank you, Yasmin, and hello, everyone. My name is Jeanette Southwood, as Yasmin mentioned. My pronouns are she, her, elle. I am Black, I am an immigrant, I'm a parent, I'm a professional engineer, and also, as Yasmin mentioned, I am Vice President, Corporate Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Engineers Canada. Prior to joining Engineers Canada, I led the Canadian Urban Development and Infrastructure sector and Global Sustainable Cities teams at an international consulting engineering firm, where I was the first Black woman to be appointed to the senior leadership position of principal globally. At Engineers Canada, my team's portfolios include public policy, public affairs, and government relations, outreach and engagement, communications, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Every year, Engineers Canada will be partnering with a different engineering regulator. For this year, we are excited to collaborate with the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta, also known as APEGA, who first conceived the 30 by 30 goal in 2010. And we're also excited to feature Alberta-based experts at the conference, experts that are influencing how equity, diversity, and inclusion is evolving beyond the borders of Alberta and beyond Canada's borders. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our facilitators for today's workshop, Lale Bejat and Meghana Valupadas. Meghana is a transportation engineer in training with ISL Engineering and Land Services from Edmonton, Alberta. Outside of her role in engineering, she is an EDI educator and facilitator, holding a designation as a Canadian Certified Inclusion Professional from the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. This year, she was named a 30 by 30 EDI champion by Engineers Canada. One fun fact about Meghana is that she's been working part-time for 8 years as a children's performer, portraying characters such as Moana and Princess Jasmine for birthday parties and fundraisers. Lale Bejat is a professional engineer and also a professor at the Department of Electrical and Software Engineering at the University of Calgary, as well as being the NSERC Chair for Women in Science and Engineering for the Prairies. Her research focuses on developing mathematical techniques and software tools for automating the design of digital integrated circuits. Lale is passionate about increasing the status of women in STEM and removing systemic barriers. Currently, she is leading a change leadership program, Wise Planet, with the mission to envision and build a just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive society. Over to you, Lale and Meghana.
Thank you so much for the very nice welcome. I am Lale Bejat. My pronouns are she, her, and together with Meghana, we'll be talking today with you on intersectionality.
Before we begin the formal presentation, we'd like to do a land acknowledgement as well. If you are attending this session from anywhere in Canada, you are likely on treaty land, and if you're participating from outside of Canada, you are on Indigenous land. So it's in the spirit of reconciliation that we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 6 and 7 regions of Alberta, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Nakota Nations, the Nahia or Cree, the Dene, Nakota Sioux, Stoney, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, and Niitsitapi Blackfoot, as well as Métis homelands and the Métis Nation regions 3 and 4. So we acknowledge that the first step in reconciliation can be to acknowledge the land that we're living on and working on. But the real work comes when we take actions to right the wrongs of the past and, of course, understand the true histories of the lands that we're on. For this, we can take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations, such as Recommendation 1194, which is providing adequate funding for First Nation students seeking post-secondary education, which is particularly important, of course, to Dr. Lale and myself. We also acknowledge that we as individuals can demonstrate leadership and action on reconciliation. So it's with this appreciation that we commit to decolonizing our own practices and ways of thinking. If you are curious about the land that you are on, there's a resource that exists called Native Land. The link can be seen at the bottom of the slide. So nativeland.ca can show you the histories of the lands that you are on, as well as the treaties that exist and the people who were on this land before many of us came to settle on this land. So feel free to take a look at Native Land to learn more about the history of the land that you are on. We'd also like to give a thanks to our healthcare workers, our frontline workers, scientists and engineers, teachers and educators, and of course, anyone who's following public health measures to keep our most vulnerable safe during these uncertain times. We have some ground rules for our presentation today, and I understand that there were also some ground rules that were presented in your conference package. So our first one is that we are only experts on ourselves. I hope that throughout this conversation, we can trust each other to be our only experts on our experiences and the stories and truths that we bring to our discussions. Our next ground rule is that emotional reactions are expected and actually welcome. The material that we are going to be going through today is quite heavy and it requires levels of vulnerability. So emotional reactions are really common and they're okay because we actually grow the most when we feel emotions like discomfort and defensiveness, which are very common reactions to the material that we might be sharing today. Our next one is that we are here to grow and challenge ourselves. So again, we grow the most when we are uncomfortable because we're pushing our boundaries and we're pushing our perspectives and paradigms. So if you feel uncomfortable, feel free to sit with that discomfort, chat with your colleagues and those around you who you trust, talk to your family and research more about what you've learned here today. Challenging ourselves and questioning our current practices is the first way that we can start to deconstruct some of the social norms with which we have grown up. Our next one is to assume good intent. So this is meant to be a safe space, and Lale will talk about a brave space where the intent is to grow and learn. So Lale and myself are here to provide that emotional labor and educational labor to you. And so there's no bad questions as long as they come from a place of wanting to learn and understand, and they're asked in a respectful way. Our next ground rule is that with vulnerability comes personal stories. So hopefully we can all respect each other's confidentiality. What is learned here leaves here, and what is said here stays here. And the last one is to honor your body's needs. So if you need to take a break, grab a snack, take a bio break, check on a family member, please feel free to do so at any time. As mentioned, this workshop might be heavy. So if you need to excuse yourself, turn off your camera, that's okay. However, we do ask if you can to refrain from multitasking. I know it's really easy, especially in a virtual setting, but we are here giving our time and we hope that you are able to, as much as you can, give your time and be present in this session.
Great, thank you, Meghana. And just a few quick notes about the different spaces we are gonna be going through today. The first one is a safe space, and it's a space to be intended to be free of bias, conflict, criticism. So things like disagreeing without being disagreeable, no threatening actions or ideas or conversations. Some of the guidelines for the safe space, and some of them we have gone through already, is agreeing to disagree, no personal attack, not taking things personally also, and assuming always to have positive intent and respect others. Safe spaces are great for when there is a low risk, which hopefully it is in this discussion, but also when the individuals are more homogeneous. So here, these small dots are supposed to be the individuals. And when individuals are all sort of coming from the same background, same language, same culture, they understand each other a lot better, and that makes the risk goes down. If there is one individual who's significantly different from others, then the risk for that individual alone can be higher, and safe spaces might not be enough. And that's why we're gonna introduce a concept of brave space. Again, this is a space to cultivate productive dialogue, where participants are encouraged to speak honestly, but also critically from their own experiences towards mutual understanding and learning. Some of the Brave Space guidelines is to have controversy with civility, distinguishing between ideas and people, again, taking care of yourself because things can become a little bit emotional, and own your intentions and impact. And then Brave Spaces are really good when there is a higher risk or a very diverse group. And finally, there could be a space also of a space of radical openness. And this is a concept introduced by Bell Hooks, who's a feminist scholar, who was a feminist scholar. Unfortunately, she passed away a few months ago. And this is a space that is basically on the margins of the social norm boundaries. And it's also a place where people is always at risk, but it's also a place that people can make real or imagined stories to basically challenge the norms and transform them to something that is better. And it's a space for critical thinking. And that's how we actually push the boundaries of what we have. So think about what we want to do today, and then think about which are part of the spaces we are able to make. And hopefully we can go all the way up to making spaces of radical openness. So we'll just start with some base definitions. Some of the slides here are adapted from a slide made by Lorena Solis, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary in psychology. She works on EDI issues related to organizational psychology. And also some of them are created by Meghana at a Kind Word Consulting. So I would like to first ask everybody to go to menti.com and enter the code 48793114. You can also use the QR code and then put in here, what does diversity mean to you? So again, if you could put in the code at menti.com I'll stop sharing and put the code up there and then share the Menti. Okay, and you can see a lot of different words coming in: representation, strengths, caring, belonging. Also very diverse responses. So some of the things that usually come up with the meaning of diversity is we can see the differences, which was also something that came up very prominently in our Menti poll. It can also be referred to gender, race, or ethnicity, different cultures, different perspective, worldviews, and other words that you are putting in. Thank you so much, and we'll add them to the list of these words for the next presentation. Now, one of the things that's important about diversity is a property of a group of people with different characteristics who basically share a space within an institution. And this could be in the university setting where I am, could be the research lab, classroom, departments, or overall campus life. And in the workplace could be the leadership team, work teams, departments, and overall organization. But the important thing about diversity to remember is that diversity refers to characteristics of a group or property of a group, not an individual. So we cannot say diversity describes a person. And this is very important to remember. Now, some of the diversity characteristics could be inherent. So these are traits that are central to someone's identity, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, or ability. Or it could be acquired through experiences, the perspectives, viewpoint, or some of the skills, social skills that people have acquired. So the acquired characteristics can also change, and people can increase their diverse point of views or communication and learn different cultures. Now, what makes a group diverse? These are some of the biggest questions I think we should ask when we want to talk about a diverse group. First is the representation of individuals from diverse backgrounds. Then also remembering who is present and who is missing in a diverse group. Why are some people more represented than others, and why and where is this overrepresentation with regards to proximity to power? So is one group of people more closer to power than other group of people? And how is the system that we are bound with, or the social norms, maintains the underrepresentation of a specific group, either in respect to proximity to power or in the overall group? And when we want to talk about these things, again, some of the good things to look at is who else should be included. What are the differences in the representations in engineering occupations? So for example, maybe there may be more women in sales than in the leadership positions or something like that. And what are where are we seeing these differences and what is happening? And I just wanted to give you a quick sort of an overview of just one dimension of diversity, which is the gender. These are the newly licensed percentage of newly licensed women in from Engineers Canada, and we can see that nationally we are at about 18%. But fortunately, this is also showing that we have changed the slope of increasing the percentage of women, and we are actually going fast, so growing fast in this part of representation. Now, some of the misuses of diversity, sometimes when there is a group and they want to increase their diversity, they take one person from an underrepresented group and then put it within the larger group. This actually makes it very misused, because the whole everything is on the shoulder of that person, and that person becomes a token. So by putting a specific one individual from one group, the overall group says that, okay, we don't have to do anything else. We can go to continue as before. And this could actually have really, really lasting impacts on the individual and on the underrepresented group overall. So the other thing is, when we talk about the diversity and representation, we also need to think about the characteristics that are associated with the history of exclusion. So we can say, like, you know, if there is a women in engineering group, this is the reason for it is the history of exclusion of that specific group. And so other characteristics to consider is the migration history, sexual orientation, disability, culture, discipline, experiences, and so on. And these are some of the things that we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about intersectionality as well. So I'm gonna skip the next poll and just quickly talk about the equity versus equality. Equity means equality means same treatment for everyone. Here there's a picture of 3 people trying to watch some men playing soccer, and there's a fence in front of them, and each one of them is given equal treatment for seeing this game, which is a box. We can see the person on the wheelchair cannot see the game at all. The shorter person can barely see, and the tall person can use the box to see. Unfortunately, equality disregards history of exclusion, such as power or privilege, and it gives everybody equal access. Now, if we want to make this equitable, we can make a ramp for the person on the wheelchair and give 2 boxes to the shorter person. And then now we can achieve better fairness by providing some more accommodations, and can also consider some of the legacies of historical injustices. Now, the problem with both of these, there's 2 problems with this picture. The first one is actually there is a fence. We can always ask, why is there a fence, or why aren't these people sitting in the stands? So how can we remove the systemic barriers might be a little bit better of a way of talking about fairness when we are talking with regards to treatment. And the second problem with this picture that I would like to quickly mention is that it assumes that people can't see the game because of their inherent characteristics, not because they weren't given a seat in the stand. So because they were short or because they were in a wheelchair, they could not see the game. So this is important to mention in this case. And that brings us to the next topic, which is inclusivity, which is the active and ongoing process of creating change and spaces for greater participation. And this is really important. A lot of the time when we talk about ways of including more women into engineering, for example, we talk about solutions that fixes the woman to be fitting within the system. But with inclusivity, we need to say, how can we change the system to be much, much better for everyone? If we do this, if we always resort to special accommodations, people who are getting those accommodations can feel stigmatized and isolated. And also other people will say this is not fair to them because they're not getting accommodation. So for example, if there is a student who needs more time to finish the exams because they have dyslexia, and they're always getting a specific accommodations, other students can say, well, they're getting more time so they can do better in their exams. Maybe another way of making it more exclusive is changing the way we do testing to actually capture the ideas that the students have, what they have learned, without having this specific time limit for them. And another way of changing the inclusion, I wanted to just bring this, we are always talking about people, women watching the men's game, but here we can think about why if everybody plays in the game. And so that's what I mean by the inclusion.
Thank you so much, Lale, for walking us through some really important definitions and concepts that are quite, important to understanding intersectionality, which it might be a new concept for a lot of people here today. So let's talk about it. What is intersectionality? Well, it was a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black professor, a civil rights advocate, a lawyer, a philosopher, a feminist, and holds a lot of other roles as well. And she created this term to describe the ways that social identities can overlap. It's important to recognize that the term intersectionality was originally used to describe how Black women are caught at the intersection of two systems of oppression. And those systems of oppression are racism and sexism. And being caught at the intersection of those two systems of oppression means that Black women often face compounding barriers in society. Intersectionality also describes the ways in which other identities overlap and affects how we interact with society and affects the way our society interacts with us. For example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the women's rights movement of the 1960s were both not accounting for the unique experiences of Black women. Often Black women were seen as experiencing either racial barriers or gendered barriers, but the recognition of the unique overlap of these barriers was not recognized. So present day, this term can actually be applied to a variety of different identities and explain how these identities overlap and affect how we see the world, which is why we have this picture of a person with various kind of colors, because we can look at intersectionality almost as lenses, colored lenses. And when we overlap them on top of one another, we see the world in a different way and we view our society in a different way. Conversely, when these lenses are overlapped, our society and the people around us see us differently. But we can't forget that these intersections were originally meant to highlight the intersections of oppression that Black women face. And so we'll talk about that in a little more depth as we go forward. So on our next slide, we have some of the different identities in which people might identify. So things like caste, socioeconomic status, your features, your skin tone, your hair or hair texture, your class, your education level, your race, language, height, the list goes on and on. We could not possibly put in all of the different ways in which people identify onto a single slide. But it's important to remember that there are so many ways we can identify, and there are so many ways that these different identities overlap. And so intersectionality isn't just looking at these identities in a silo or in a vacuum, it's looking at all the different ways that they overlap and create unique experiences that each of us has. So let's do an example. I'd like to talk about myself. So intersectional Meghana. Well, some traits about me are that I am university educated. I have a darker skin tone. I identify as LGBTQ+. I am East Indian. I live with mental illness. I am able-bodied, and I have a very Canadian accent. Now, all of these traits that I've described change the way in which my society interacts with me and changes the way in which I am able to interact with my society based on things like power and privilege, which is what we'll get into in a couple slides. But first, we'd like you to help us out. So let's talk about you, intersectional you. Your traits are different from your neighbors, and that's diversity. And your traits also interact with one another, leading you to be treated differently, even if you have similar traits to the people around you, because intersectionality is complicated. For example, myself and Lale were both engineers, but our identities lead us to be treated differently in the engineering world or in other spaces. Same with you and your neighbors, your virtual neighbors. You might identify in the same way as other people in this room, but you might be treated differently or treat other people differently based on your experiences or your identity traits. So we'd like you to write down some phrases that describe who you are. You could take out a phone, take out a pad of paper, or even just think about some phrases. Some examples could include things like ethnicity, your languages that you speak, whether it be your first language or languages you later learned, your height or appearance, your career, your experiences, your gender identity, so how you identify inside, versus your gender expression, which is how you use your appearance to show your gender or express your gender, your abilities or disabilities, your romantic or sexual orientations, or even your name. So we'd like you to take just a minute and write down some of these traits that describe who you are. If you feel comfortable, you can even use the Menti poll to throw in some of the traits that describe who you are. And it's always quite interesting to see what traits people feel really close to versus what traits some people might not feel very close to or might not pop into their heads right away. So take a moment, head over to the Menti poll using the code 48793114, which is also in the chat, or using the QR code. And let's see what people have come up with for describing themselves. So Lale is going to bring us to our Menti poll where people are writing down some different phrases to describe themselves. All right, we have some really great diversity in the room. So, we have everything from career choices to different traits or values to maybe the roles that we play in our life. So things like wife and mom, engineer seems to be a big one that is coming up, immigrant, cisgendered. Yep, we see lots of different traits. So what this Menti word cloud kind of does is it does highlight the diversity in the room. It also highlights the things that a lot of us have in common and the ways we identify. And we can also see that a lot of these traits are going to be overlapping with one another. So you can keep adding to the word cloud. Thank you everyone so much. And keep in mind some of the traits that you have identified in this exercise because we'll be using them for a couple other things. So on our next slide, we also need to account for the idea that our different identities exist in different ways. So some of them are a choice, when some of them are not a choice. Some of them are visible and some of them are invisible. So some of our traits, when we enter a room, we do not get a say in how people interact with us based on traits that might be visible. So things like our hair or hair texture, our ethnicity or race, our skin tone, or even our age, things that are visible and are things that people can judge us on right away. Versus things that might be invisible. So things like your sexual orientation, your health, your abilities and disabilities, or your mental illness. Some of these things aren't a choice, things like gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or abilities and disabilities. And some are a choice. It's like your education or your profession, the way you express your gender, or your name. So I'd like you to take a second and think about the traits that you wrote down that were top of mind for you, and identify them as traits that are a choice, not a choice, visible or invisible. And as you can see, some of these traits fall into different categories. So it's not clean cut. Some might span multiple categories, some might not fall into any. So take a moment and categorize some of your traits as choice, not a choice, visible or invisible. And we'll give folks just about a minute to do that. And the reason why we're getting everyone to categorize these traits is that we are going to move into an exercise about power and privilege, where we'll be considering some of these traits and things that we have power over, the things we don't have power over, the things that give us power, and the things that might take away our power in society. So we'll give everyone about 30 more seconds to categorize some of the traits that they've written down. So keep those traits where you can see them. And then we're going to move into our next concept, which is very closely linked to intersectionality. And that concept is the concept of privilege. So privilege is a social dynamic where certain ways of being or existing are normalized and they're deemed superior. So essentially, privilege is what we are born with / into based on what is valued in society. And that definition will come up. We also have a little picture on the left, which shows two people running a race. Now, the person on the left looks like a darker skinned person. It looks like they're a woman, and they're in kind of track clothing, and they have a ball and chain tied to their leg, versus the person on the left looks like an older person, looks like a man, looks like a white man, and he's dressed very well. And the caption at the bottom is, "What's the matter? It's the same distance." So we can see that one person, the person on the left, has less barriers that they have to overcome to get to the finish line, versus the person on the right, who has a lot more barriers that they have to consider in their existence. So if we click on the slide, we have the definition that comes up. And if we click again, this actually can lead to an unequal distribution of a couple things. And that's resources, power, unearned benefits, and potential and opportunity. Now, it's really important to understand, just like when Lale was talking about equity versus equality, that there's nothing wrong with our inherent traits or our acquired traits. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them. It's the ways in which our society values certain traits, or the ways in which certain traits are deemed superior based on who is in power, that causes this unequal distribution. So another way to think of privilege is, if you could choose the traits that you were born with, what would you choose? Would you choose to be born male? Would you choose to be born white? Would you choose to be born rich? Would you choose to be born in a nuclear family with a mom and a dad and some siblings? So this is what is meant by unearned. Another thing to ask yourself is, would you trade places with someone else in the room? Why or why not? Now, if we were all born equal and if we were all treated equally in our society, that wouldn't be a question. There would be no hesitation if we could just switch places with one another. But I think we know that that's not exactly true. Another way to think about privilege is, did you learn about your family history in school, or was it considered a special unit? Or does your work give you holidays for your cultural or religious days off? Or are those things that you have to request, or just, I guess, like not even consider? You still have to go to work or go to school despite your cultural or religious holidays. And we have a video that I feel very nicely kind of further talks about privilege from the perspective of white privilege.
We've been engaged in a global conversation about race and racism. You've probably had discussions at home, at school, or at work, and in those conversations, you've probably heard the term white privilege. You may have even had this term used in a way that felt like an insult or an accusation. Others will have told you that it's all just made up to make white people feel bad, and none of this is right. Privilege is a hard concept for people to understand, because normally when we talk of privilege, we imagine immediate, unearned riches and tangible benefits for anyone who has it. But white privilege, and indeed all privilege, is actually more about the absence of inconvenience, the absence of an impediment or challenge. And as such, when you have it, You really don't notice it. But when it's absent, it affects everything you do. There are lots of types of privilege out there. The privilege of being born into a wealthy family versus a poor family is kind of obvious. But then there's the privilege of being able-bodied versus having or acquiring a disability that most of us take for granted. I have two very close friends who are wheelchair users, and I'll be honest, when I first met them, I was completely ignorant about the everyday ways their lives are made harder through no fault of their own. Some of these ways are simply thoughtless, but some of them are just the way we live, just the way we build infrastructure, just the way everything works. That just makes their life harder than mine. That's just one of the ways that I'm privileged. And understanding that, embracing that, doesn't make me a bad person. But ignoring it raises the chance that my friends will be excluded in ways that are not obvious to me. And as their friend, I can't allow that. There's a good chance, as a white person watching this, your life is already hard. Every day you have to overcome some difficulty or challenge just to get by, but you can still have white privilege. White privilege doesn't mean you haven't worked hard or you don't deserve the success you've had. It doesn't mean that your life isn't hard or that you've never suffered. It simply means that your skin color has not been the cause of your hardship or suffering. There is nothing but a benefit to understanding our own privileges, white and otherwise. It brings us closer to those who are different. It helps us be vigilant about the ways we treat others different than us. It helps us make a society that is fairer and more equal. Having white privilege doesn't make your life easy, but understanding it can help you realize why some people's lives are harder than they should be.
So I really like that video in particular because
Even
one thing
engaged.
that he kind of hones on is infrastructural barriers. So as engineers, I find this to be really important because if we don't understand our own privileges, we can't truly build infrastructure or systems that are inclusive. As engineers, we make a lot of decisions that impact a lot of different people and the way that they can really take part in our society and the way that they can access different things. So I think the
Even
point
engaged.
about infrastructure is particularly important. So let's talk about privilege and power then. For every single identity trait or every single way in which someone identifies, it kind of exists on a spectrum. We have the identities in our society that are more valued, that are more privileged, that are given more access to opportunities and unearned benefits. And then we also have identities that are not given those same privileges, do not have the same power, do not have the same influence, and do not have those same benefits. And so I've chosen a couple here. I've chosen to talk about accents, skin tone, and education. So for myself, if we talk about accents, I have a very Canadian accent, which means that when I speak on the phone with someone, they can't assume anything about my ethnicity or my background or the way that I look. I find that this gives me a lot of privilege. Whereas someone like my mom, who has a more heavy Indian accent, she actually worked in a call center for a long time, and she was told quite often to go back to her country or that she shouldn't be living here in Canada. So my Canadian accent gives me privileges in that I don't face the same barriers or the same types of discrimination that I might face if I have an accent that is, quote unquote, non-Canadian. So if we talk about skin tone, folks with lighter skin tone tend to be given more benefits, the greater benefit of the doubt, than folks with darker skin tone. There are tons of studies that back this up that show that folks with darker skin tone have been traditionally excluded in many, many different ways. Now, I have a medium skin tone, which means that I do face some barriers in regards to my skin tone, but I also face a lot of, I'm also given a lot of privilege when it comes to my skin tone. And then with education, because I have a university education, people think of me as a lot smarter than maybe folks who have a high school education. What that means is I'm given more privilege and more influence in the circles that I'm in the discussions that I'm in the decisions that I get to make, simply because I had access to post-secondary education and I had the ability to pursue a post-secondary education. So there's a lot of ways in which we hold privilege, and there's a lot of ways in which we hold power. And again, it's about recognizing the ways in which we hold privilege so that we can account for how others may not hold privilege or how others may face barriers based on their unique identities.
Okay, and we wanted to show you an exercise about how some of these privileges are very arbitrary. So we first want to talk about the Will of Power. This is made by Sylvia Duckworth. It's the Will of Power and shows the sort of access to how much power you have based on some of the acquired dimensions that you might have. So for example, if you have post-secondary education, you have higher access to power, as Megan has mentioned, than if you have an elementary education. The same way goes with body size, housing, wealth, language, gender, and so on. So for some people, they might have access to some to higher access in some ways, and they might be marginalized in other ways. But to make this a little bit more tangible and show you how these could be just really arbitrary, we actually are having a short exercise. So the exercise is to propose a social activity for next year's 30 by 30 conference. Apparently we know the location now, so we can only focus on the social activity that we all want to do for next year's conference. And here's the deal. We have picked some letters that if your name starts with letter A, E, G, L, M, N, and H, then you have highest access to power, which means you can talk at any time you want when you go into your breakout rooms. Now, these letters were just the letters of our first names of myself and Megan. So sort of not really relevant to anything we are going to talk about, but just sort of we needed to choose some letters over others. Now, if your name starts with letters B, D, J, P, T, U, V, these are the letters of our last names combined, then you can only talk when your opinion is asked for. So if someone who can always talk asks you for your opinion, then you can say your opinion about what should we do next year for 30 by 30 conference. And then finally, if you have these other letters, C, F, I, K, O, Q, R, W, X, Y, Z, then you can only put your opinion in the chat if someone asks about it. Is there any questions about this exercise? If you want to remember these, please take a screenshot of the letters of this page to remember that. And we're going to go into the breakout rooms. We have about 7 minutes to talk about what should be the social activity. And then the last thing is, please make sure that at the end of it, have someone to put those social activities in the chat when we come back to the group, so that folks from the Engineers Canada know what to do. I see there's a few things in the chat. Yeah. Okay. With that, would you please start the breakout rooms? Okay. Thank you all for doing that exercise. I hope it went well. Some of the observations I had was, first of all, everybody stuck to the rules. But when we asked people whose names were not in the first group or closest to the power, they all thanked me for asking them. And that was really amazing because I thought it was such an arbitrary exercise, and me, who hadn't given them the privilege in the first place, being thanked for asking them about their opinions. But you can see that sometimes very, very arbitrary things can change how we have access to power and so on. So I wanted to ask everyone to think about how do they think the power and marginalization can impact their inclusion in the bigger world. So in terms of how in your work or in the general society, we'd be happy to hear those in the chat. Also, if your group, we had a lot of good discussion about what we should do in Halifax next year. So please, if you have any other suggestions what to do in Halifax, also put them in the chat as well. Megan, do you want to say anything about your group?
Yeah, it was very interesting. I think some of you all might have also found this. It was kind of uncomfortable, for a lot of folks who might have had to just sit back, or like for folks like myself who were obnoxiously dominating the conversation to make a point. So it's an uncomfortable situation, but it really kind of shows what a lot of people go through day to day in our work meetings.
And it seems that some people can only send chats to me and some people can send it all. I don't know. I didn't set up the chats, I guess, correctly. So
folks,
sorry about that.
You should be able to, where the chat says to, choose who you are directing your comment towards. It could be any of the co-hosts, or it could be to everyone in the meeting.
Okay, and it seems only the co-host can message to everyone in the meeting. Sorry, it was, yeah. But yes, please, if you want to send the chats to me. And okay, I just wanted to also get a little bit of a context of EDI in an engineering culture and how these systems of power are made in engineering. This is based on the research done by Robin Paul, who is a PhD student in engineering education at the University of Calgary. And so some of the things in the engineering culture is, first of all, it is difficult. The culture is that engineering is very difficult. It's also very elite and individualistic. So we think of who's number one, who's the best. It's very hierarchical in most places, and it's also very masculine. And I want to show you how this changes our inclusivity and access to power. When we say engineering is very hard, it means that people think about that you have to be very smart to understand engineering. But this is absolutely not true. Maybe you're having a bad day, you can't understand the concept, or it is something that is not being described correctly, the culture is different, and so on. But when people think that this difficulty in understanding a concept or progressing in some specific topic or a way it is taught relates to their inherent characteristics, they feel that they should be excluded from that culture. The second one is it's very individualistic and elitist. So it focuses on the individual ideologies to set goal versus the teamwork or personal development. So you are either the best or you're not. And that means that you can never become part of a team that successfully does that, which unfortunately engineering is very done in a team, and the teams can be a lot more successful than any individual on their own. The next one is very hierarchical. So the person on the top should know the best. But there's actually a lot of research that shows people who are about 6 or 7 layers down from the top usually know the best way, are the best experts in a specific topics. And if we use those expertise, we can actually find much better, more diverse perspectives and solutions to the problems. So by thinking about all the knowledge is sort of concentrated at the top, it promotes passive participation of everybody else. So again, inclusive, it becomes a very exclusive workplace. And finally, it is a masculine culture. So it makes promotes a chilly climate, especially for women and other underrepresented groups who might not think they are part of the elite brand of engineering. And these beliefs are transmitted to the women, and they think that they are just not welcomed in a specific place. So just sort of finishing the wheel of power. And so all of these sort of cultural issues also makes us think about access to power and inclusivity within the bigger society.
Thank you, Lale, for going over that. We are going to move into a group activity on intersectionality. So taking everything that we've learned so far in the presentation, we're going to be heading into some group discussions that will be facilitated. So in each room, there will be participants, there will be one facilitator, and there will be one scenario that you are given. So the questions that we would like you to consider are as follows. In the scenario, what systems of oppression, so for example, racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, can be identified in the scenario. The next question we would like you to consider is who in the scenario holds power? So who has the most influence? Who has the most privilege? And why do they hold the most power? The next question is, what are some ways that individuals with more power or more privilege can show allyship? And we'll dive into allyship a little bit more later on in the presentation. But for now, we'll define allyship as speaking up or showing up for folks who of a marginalized identity who have less power when you are not of that identity. So that's how we'll look at allyship. And then the fourth question is, what systemic changes can be made to dismantle the barriers in the scenario? So that kind of takes us back to question one. So what systems of oppression or what barriers exist in the scenario? And what can be done to change the system so that we can allow for greater participation and more inclusive spaces? So that's what we'd like you to take with you. Yasmin has put the questions in the chat. Facilitators or other folks as well, please feel free to take a screenshot or a photo of this group activity. And we're going to be moving into Jamboards. So the way that Jamboards work is we are going to put a link in the general chat here. As well, facilitators will have that link and they will navigate you to the scenario that matches your breakout room. So scenario 1 for breakout room 1, scenario 2 for breakout room 2, etc. And you will be able to anonymously put in your ideas on sticky notes in the Jamboard, which is just a virtual space where you can add all your notes. So with that, we will get everyone moved into their Jamboard spaces and into their breakout rooms. All right, everyone. So as we filter back from our breakout activities, I hope they were really interesting. I hope they were challenging, and I hope you folks had some great discussion. So there is a little debrief that we'd like to do. So if you can head to Menti again. So we have the code up on the screen. There are a couple questions that we'd like you to consider. And those questions are, what were the things that you understand? So what things in the scenario to you were, old hat, you understood that, you didn't need to question it too much or Google anything, you just understood it. The next question is, what challenged you? So were there any perspectives that challenged you, or were there any parts of the scenario that challenged you? The next question is, what surprised you? Whether it was a different perspective or whether it was part of the discussion, what might have surprised you? And what did you learn? So did you learn anything from the discussion, from some of the sticky notes that were put down from the facilitators, from your fellow participants? And the last one is, what are you unlearning? So did you find that any of your perspectives, again, challenged you and made you kind of think, that's something that I've learned to consider the norm, or that's something that I've learned to consider as, just how life is. Maybe I need to unlearn that as the norm. It was something that you might have grown up with, or something that you might have just seen a lot growing up. So maybe what's something that you are unlearning? And we'd love to hear some of your takeaways. One of the questions that we had in my group that we didn't get a chance to discuss, but was really interesting, had to do with allyship. So, walking the fine line between being an ally, but also not speaking over someone else, particularly someone else of a historically excluded identity. So that was something that actually challenged me a little bit, and maybe we can speak about that at some point. But yes, head to Menti, and we'd love to hear some of your thoughts and takeaways on these questions. Wow, so we have some great thoughts pouring in. Yeah, so we had a tendency to infer what intersectionality was at play. So addressing systemic change was a challenge. Absolutely. And I think that's something that we see in reality as well, is that when we look at different situations, we infer what identities are in the situation, we infer what power dynamics are in the situation, but we will never be able to have someone tell us, what is actually happening. It's just up to us to do the research, educate ourselves so we can better understand some of these situations. Yeah, sometimes through cultural expectations. We cannot understand our own experiences. So putting a name on things can help unpack that. I was challenged to being biased. I think a lot of us are really challenged to being biased, even reading the scenarios, some of the names in the scenarios, some of the careers that were in the scenarios or situations. We might have created our own ideas about what the scenario was about. So that might be our biases kicking in. Questions about how can you be a good ally, or like the allyship question challenged us. Yes, we will get into allyship a little bit as well. Yeah, unlearning that everyone's voice story is given equal opportunity. It just isn't so. That's right. Not everyone's story is given equal opportunity. It's difficult to label systems of oppression. Absolutely. Yeah, we see lots of things in here. Your name alone can allow privilege. Absolutely. And if you have any more thoughts that you'd like to place in the chat, or you'd like to put on the question for Mentimeter, please feel free to do so. And we are going to be heading into the next part of the presentation now.
And I just wanted to mention that you can actually look at the same Jamboard and see the other scenarios and also the answers that the other groups came up with, just in case you are interested.
Absolutely, great point, Lale. All right. So we are going into a couple actions, because usually after a session like this, people are feeling very action oriented. They want to know what they can do right now in regards to challenging these systems of oppression, or in regards to creating more inclusive spaces. So we have 7 individual actions that we are going to challenge you with. We have 7 different ones, because action can look different for different people depending on their identity, depending on the power that they hold, or the situations they're finding themselves in. So hopefully it provides a lot of different ways in which you can implement DEI practices, acknowledge intersectionality in your day-to-day. So the first one is education. So the world is actually at your fingertips. So if we can go to the next slide, when it comes to educating yourselves, you can actually do lots. So researching, we are very, very lucky to live in a world where the internet is quite accessible nowadays. And so the world is at your fingertips. There are lots of articles, there's lots of great research, lots of think pieces that exist about intersectionality, about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it might feel a little bit overwhelming, but just as Yasmin at the very beginning of this session shared with the group a book that she found very interesting, that challenged her, feel free to do your own research, to challenge yourselves and to learn more about the language that you use, the different power dynamics that might be at play, how to be a better ally. So research is one of the things. The next one is community. So learn what's going on in your local community. If it seems too overwhelming to put your ear to the ground and try to figure out every single thing that's going on in the world, that's totally fair. So start small, learn what's going on in your family, in your workplace, in your work circles, the people that you manage, etc. So learn what's going on in your community and what different issues people are facing, or what systemic barriers people are challenged with. And then another one is to listen. So we can actually learn so much simply by believing those who are brave enough to share their experiences, particularly those who were historically excluded or who are excluded to this day. So believing people is a really great way to challenge your perspective, especially things that you might not experience yourself. The next thing is to pay attention. So now that we've equipped you with some different concepts and with some different terminology, ask yourself some questions, especially in those spaces that you work in. Sometimes you do need to just pay more attention to notice things that you might have previously just accepted to be the norm. So some of these questions might be things to consider. So what do you see at work? The next one is, what microaggressions do you hear? And microaggressions could simply be replaced with, challenging situations, situations of discrimination or intolerance. What do you hear? What do you see? Where might you see unconscious bias? I know that some people were challenged by their own biases in this last scenario. So where might you see unconscious bias come up in your workspaces? What is tolerated at work? What is not tolerated at work? So what is the normalized work culture? The next one is in meetings, where are people seated in the room? So understanding how intersectionality and how power and privilege affects, us in very physical ways. Next one is who talks the most, barring sessions, with facilitators and with presenters, who in your spaces tends to talk the most? And conversely, who do people mostly listen to? So who holds a lot of power to influence others? And another one is who gets talked over. And you might start to see some patterns with some of these questions once you start asking yourself these things. So don't be afraid to be critical. Don't be afraid to question things. And when you start to notice different things, have conversations about them. That's the only way that we can really get the ball rolling and make EDI more commonplace in the workplace. So the next action is about leadership. So generally, the folks who are able to have the most influence and power are folks who are at the top of the hierarchies. But the issue is a lot of the DEI work tends to fall on folks who are in marginalized or historically excluded groups. And so we often find that there's an exploitation of labor of these groups, always asking the folks who experience racism to be the ones who are leading anti-racism work, even though they don't necessarily hold the most power to create change. So leadership is really important here. And accountability starts at the highest levels of an organization, because DEI integration must be individual, which is kind of what we're talking about here, but it also must be systemic, like the ways that we talked about systemic changes in those past scenarios. So the more power you have, the more responsibility you have to create a more inclusive and safer space. So we have some examples as well about ways that leadership can show their support. So if we click it one more time, there are some examples. So creating inclusive spaces, creating ground rules for participation in meetings or in difficult conversations, showing your support visibly, whether that means, having a pride flag in your office to show that you are a space that supports LGBTQ folks. Mandating EDI training is something that can go directly through leadership. The acknowledgement of the issues that you are finding in your company or the barriers you are seeing in your organization. Listening and learning from other people, especially folks of historically excluded identities, and creating policies that are transparent around things like pay, around promotion, or around different practices or programs that you have. So that's the way that leadership can really show accountability and, use their power responsibly. The next one is practicing allyship. So on the left, we have a post that was made by Sirat Chawla on Instagram talking about in anti-racism what performative allyship looks like. And performative allyship is exactly what it sounds like. It's tokenism, it's reactivity, and it's not informed. Generally, it's words that aren't backed by any form of meaningful action. So that can look like things like allyship where you are directly benefiting as opposed to the folks who you are trying to provide the allyship to. It's largely optical. So you're doing things because it makes you look a certain way. It's your PR or your public brand management. It is fragility or being afraid to challenge your norms. You might be resentful for having to practice allyship or feel pressured, everyone's doing it, so I have to do it. Or maybe your allyship showed up after you were called out. These are all examples of performative allyship. Again, they are centering yourself and not centering the identities that you are trying to provide that allyship for. Now, looking at the other side of it, let's look at authentic allyship. Now, authentic allyship is things like donating your time, donating your resources or money, donating space. It's about listening or speaking up and speaking out and amplifying the voices of other people. And it's about educating yourself. So what that looks like are things like sitting with your discomfort. After a session like this or after you're challenged, you might feel uncomfortable. If you're able to sit sit with that discomfort and try to do some reflection on where that's coming from, that in itself is authentic allyship. It's not anything flashy that you can, post on your social media, but it's doing the real, genuine work. It's recognizing that it's not about you. It is about the people that you are showing up to be an ally for. It is committing to difficult work and committing to a lot of difficult discussions with yourself and with other people who hold power in different spaces. You are taking risks, and brand is not a concern to you. You are doing something because you feel like it is the right thing to do to create more inclusive spaces. And you're educating yourself and examining your own privilege and using it to help. So again, a lot of these actions aren't flashy. They're not things that you can make a post about. They're not things that you can take a picture of, but they're things that you can do to make yourself a better ally, to show up in more authentic and genuine ways for other people. So that is allyship. Excuse me. So the next thing is that language really matters. So often we hear phrases like the one that's on the right, which is, "You are so well spoken for an immigrant." And phrases like that are considered microaggressions because they have a very subtle and toxic subtext to them, which is the implication that someone who is an immigrant could not possibly be speaking a certain language fluently. So what's important to remember with language is that good words and bad words, they don't exist. Language is fluid and it's always changing. New words are introduced. Old words are often reclaimed. Definitions and connotations change as society changes. There's no such thing as what is right to say and what is wrong to say. So I hear the phrase a lot, what am I even allowed to say nowadays? There isn't what you are allowed to say. There's simply what we choose to say. So it's important to remember a couple things. So is your language accurate? So to ensure the words that we use are accurate to convey the messages that we intend to say. So for example, if I intend to address a group of gender diverse people, would saying, "Hey guys," actually convey my message? Or could I change my language to be more accurate for the group who I am addressing? The second thing is agency. So if we click, we'll see these words. We have agency over the words that we choose to keep in our vocabulary. So for example, if I'm told that something that I've said is harmful or discriminatory, I have the agency to choose my language and to choose the language that I'm going to keep in my vocabulary and the language that I'm going to phase out. And lastly, we are accountable for the language that we choose. So ignorance is not an excuse, especially, with a lot of information that is at our fingertips. So if we've said something and we get called out or called in for it, we are accountable for the language that we choose. So remember, we have to choose language that is accurate, and we have agency over the language that we choose, and we have accountability for the language that we say. So on the next slide, we've actually changed, what is in the speech bubble to what we actually mean to say is, "You're a great speaker." That's what we mean to say. That shows the accuracy of what we're trying to intend. So what are some tips for self-reflection about language? Well, the first one is there a power difference between your behavior and the person whom it targets? So think about that when you say something. The next one is what you're going to say, does it stereotype, assume, or label an individual or a group of people? The next thing to consider is, would it make someone uncomfortable because of their identity? This often comes up a lot with jokes. People ask the question, am I even allowed to make a joke nowadays? Well, there are a lot of fun things that we can say that don't make people uncomfortable because of the way they identify. So reflect on that. If to defend your behavior, you have to use arguments such as, I have freedom of speech, or my ancestors were oppressed too, or it was just a joke. Remember, allyship, we don't want to center ourselves. So if we're using arguments like that to defend our language, it's probably better off left unsaid. So when in doubt, leave it out. So these are just some simple tips for self-reflection of your language, but it's really important to remember to come back to those 3 A's that we mentioned: accuracy, agency, and accuracy, agency, and accountability. So the next thing that we are going to talk about is apologizing. So what happens if you say something or you do something and you're called out? Someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, that was harmful, that was dismissive, that wasn't okay." What do you do in that scenario? Well, apologizing is a skill, and it's something that a lot of us have to learn to do. And the first step in apologizing is acknowledging the occurrence, because dismissive attitudes are just as harmful as the behaviors themselves. So this is especially important for leaders because you are setting an example for your team. The next step is to understand why what you did was harmful. So that's going back to that step about educating yourself. So doing your own research and not asking the person who you've harmed to educate you on why it was harmful. There's nothing wrong with asking, for them to share their feelings if they're comfortable, but understanding maybe the historical context or the connotations of what you've said, you can do your own research about that. Step 3 is apologizing with intention and with informed meaning. So once you've done your research, you will be able to apologize intentionally. So instead of saying things like, I'm sorry you felt that way, or I'm sorry you were offended, you can say, I'm sorry I offended you, with the language that I used. And the last one is to be open to input from the person who was discriminated against, or the person who was hurt by your language or harmed by your language or your behaviors. So be open to listening and learning from them. Practicing phrases like, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, I came from an uneducated and ignorant place, or, I'm putting in the work to be more informed about this, or asking questions like, what can I do to support you? Or what can I do to be a better ally for you, are really important when it comes to apologizing. So there are some tips there. And then if you find that you are on the receiving end of harmful behavior or discrimination, it's also important to take care of yourself. So we hope that you aren't, but we don't live in a perfect world. We've seen that from the presentation. So what can you do? You can assume good intent or ask for clarification. I love to ask the question, what did you mean by that? Because when someone says something that's made me uncomfortable, it gives them the chance to challenge themselves and think, ooh, what did I mean like that? Was I being accurate in my language and what I was trying to say? So you might want to save yourself a little bit of, having to educate them by just saying, what did you mean by that? Or pick your battles and consider your safety. As someone of a more marginalized identity, it is not your job to educate other people, no matter if they ask for you to educate them. The next one is to separate yourself from the occurrence. Unfortunately, we can't always do that, but doing simple things like turning off your camera or just getting to a different space in your head and zoning out for a second to separate yourself in your head from the occurrence, or physically if you can, might help you preserve your well-being. The next one is to bring people in as opposed to calling them out. So wherever possible, when you feel like you can do that, taking people to the side instead of calling them out in front of a group of people, that can also help with the discussion and creating, a safer space for you to discuss your feelings instead of having to discuss them in front of a group of people. Finding your social supports is really important. So that could be a family member or a friend, someone else that understands or is willing to empathize with what you are going through and can validate your experiences. And then recognize when it crosses the line into abuse. So a lot of what we've kind of talked about today with, discrimination, with these systems of oppression are things that a lot of people deal with on a day-to-day basis. And they're things that are harmful and things that we need to, be on the forefront of tackling. But sometimes it crosses the line into abuse, into bullying. And that's when we need to make sure that we recognize the difference between, educating someone who's asking something with good intent and going into more toxic situations where you do not hold power and you might not be able to provide that education in a way that the person will take that well. So recognizing that line. And we'd like to leave you all with a quote by Audre Lorde, who was a Black feminist, lesbian, poet, writer, and activist. Audre Lorde said, "There is no such thing as single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. And I think that's really important when it comes to this discussion of intersectionality. We are such multi-layered and multifaceted people. We are complex and we live complex lives. So we do not live single issue lives." And so for the last kind of 15 minutes, we'd like to go into some peer Q&A breakout rooms. So in the breakout rooms, we would like you to—
Actually, Meghana, because it's getting a little bit late, maybe we can just have a group Q&A. Would
Sure.
that work? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So folks, if you're comfortable, we have about 15 minutes for a Q&A. You can throw your question into the chat, or you can direct your question to myself or Lale, and we can try to answer it in the time that we have left. If you are not comfortable putting it in the chat or reaching out to us right now, this is our contact information. You can feel free to send us an email, reach out to us on LinkedIn, or reach out to us via Twitter or Instagram, and we'd be happy to continue the discussion there.
There's a question about having the slides. I have to check with Meghana and the Engineers Canada, and I'll get back to you.
I had to make sure I unmuted. Thanks very much. Very engaging discussion. That sort of supports a lot of the readings that a lot of us have done on active bystander and looking at microaggressions and all the things like that. So one of the questions I have is, we all come from different spaces. We all come from different backgrounds. And as we found out during the scenario that we went through, some based on our background see different issues in the scenario than others do. And, I've tried to do a lot of research. Research, doesn't provide a full perspective, and the person I'm speaking to may not even come from the same mindset as the research I'm doing. So how can we ask people to share their experience knowing full well that they may not want to? But is there an approach we can use that is not threatening or trying to show allyship and learn more from an individual experience? How would you suggest we go about trying to show that compassion and understanding and educate ourselves more?
That's a great question, Paul. Lale, did you want to speak to that, or would you like me to go ahead?
You can start. Yeah.
Absolutely. Feel free to jump in. That's a really great question, because a lot of times folks won't be comfortable sharing their experiences, even if it could be valuable learning for other people. And of course, it's not anyone's job to be a learning point. But there are some things that we can do. Creating a really welcoming, confidential space for people is important. So just knowing that, if I share an experience with you, you'll take it for your own learning, but you won't, share it with other people. Or if you're asking someone to share an experience, but maybe taking some of those identifying details out, so like a name or like an organization, making it a more kind of general or generic scenario if you'd like to use that for any sort of learning or share that. But I think one thing that is kind of underrated is just surrounding ourselves with different kinds of people. So looking at the circles that we are in and taking a look and seeing, like, do I have a diverse friend group? Am I around people of different experiences and different perspectives? And of course, we don't want to surround ourselves with people just so we can learn different perspectives. But on the flip side, surrounding ourselves with different people whose presence we enjoy and whose lives that we can give to can also allow us to change our perspectives, challenge our perspectives, and learn in different ways. So that's a couple ways that we can kind of learn from other people while still respecting their experiences and still respecting that their experiences are their own and aren't necessarily meant for us to learn off of. Lale, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say also, sometimes imagination is really good. I had made this, actually it was one of the exercises, but I changed it because I thought it takes too long to set up. But like, it's just to imagine that there's a word that's made for people who are short. So for women, because women always worked in the office and men always worked outside. And so all the doors are shorter, the tables are shorter, the chairs are shorter. And so men decide to come and work inside, and they come in and like they sit at the table, and the table flips because their legs are too long. And like, the boss woman turns around and says, hey, I put my neck on you for bringing you here. So next time, like, be more considerate or sit at the back, or those different things. And you can see that when you tell the scenario to women, they come up with all of these things that has been happening, all of these microaggressions or inequities that have been happening to them. But it is sort of like, when you put it in a different perspective, it comes out. And I think it is really good to sort of use this mental perspective taking scenarios to sort of figure out what is actually happening here and process it, and then come up with solutions that is more inclusive. I hope I answered that question. There is a question about microaggression, usually seen with new hires, how to address it, especially if it is done by your boss or supervisor.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that, common phrases that we can practice, especially because being talked over is a microaggression, and it's something that a lot of people don't notice that they're doing, but ignorance is not an excuse. So practicing statements like, hey, I wasn't done my idea, or, okay, hold on, I just want to finish speaking about my idea and then we can come to you. Or recommending having a speakers list. So, someone in the meeting takes note of people who raised their hand, and then having an active speakers list going so we know who exactly is speaking, anyone who's speaking out of turn doesn't, we can let them just get their name onto the speakers list instead. So things like that can often help with folks who get spoken over. If you notice that someone in particular is speaking over people a lot, you can, call that person in, bring them to the side, and let them know that they might be taking up too much space in a meeting, and that it might be, best, like obviously you don't want to stifle anyone, but at the same time, having them recognize that everyone in the meeting should have a chance to speak. One way you can do that also as a leader is in different spaces, saying the phrase, everyone gets a chance to speak, so we'll do a round table. So creating those more equitable ways to divvy up time. Also as a leader, not being afraid to cut people off. So if someone has gone on for 5 minutes and, you have 5 minutes left for 5 other people to speak, not being afraid to cut them off and saying, hey, just to be cognizant of time, we want everyone to get a chance to speak. So we'll come back to you if we have time at the end, but I'd actually like to hear from so-and-so first. So there are some little ways that we can kind of address that. Lale?
Yeah, I think having champions when you're having microaggressions or championing others when you see them is really also can be really, really powerful. And also when people come and talk to you about microaggressions that they're seeing, knowing that it took a lot of courage for them to come and talk about it, and then make sure that you actually do something about it. There's another question about tokenism and any recommendations that on how we can differentiate between being inclusive versus being tokenized. And I do find this a lot in my work, a difference between being inclusive versus being token. Person who's being tokenized always understands that they are there just to sort of have this sort of impact that, oh, we ticked check mark. And so I understand, like I have actually been like in this situation quite a few times, and a few times I actually tried to do things that changes the system. So the system cannot always be based on we vote on something, because if you are the only person with that perspective, I can't just say, oh, I don't think this is the right thing to do, and then we vote on it and everybody else says, no, we should do whatever we have always done. So change cannot happen. The other thing is that sometimes just not being on the table, but in a public way, say, I cannot be on this table unless you change the process that you're working on and make it more inclusive. That actually also helps a lot.
And we have one more question that we have time for. So we have a question about allyship. So stepping in as an ally, but sometimes people get offended on behalf of others when the person who was the target might want to handle it themselves or handle it differently. So how do we avoid the white savior complex and centering ourselves when we are indeed trying to help? So speaking to that, checking in is really, really helpful. So, whether that's recognizing the situation, stepping in and saying, hey, I just want to see how everything's going here. If you heard something that might have been discriminatory, using your platform to say, to kind of dismantle that, what you heard was discriminatory. Or if you think the person might want to handle it themselves, stepping in and saying, hey, I'm just here to join the conversation. So-and-so would, is there anything that you'd like to say? So kind of handing them the mic, or allowing them to handle it themselves, and then checking in after and saying, hey, I noticed that you went through a tough situation there. Would you have preferred someone to step in, or would it have helped for someone to step in so that doesn't happen again? So checking in can really help, so we don't center ourselves, so we don't, fall into that savior complex about I have more power, so therefore I need to be the one to be talking over this person. Lale, any thoughts on that?
No, you said it all.
Okay. So I think we need to end the session now. I know that there were some more questions, so feel free to contact myself or Lale if you'd like to continue the discussion. There are a lot of great questions in the chat. We can't get to all of them, but I hope that you can, discuss with your folks, chat with your colleagues, and maybe come to some great conclusions as well. Lale, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for their great contributions, and it was a pleasure and it was an honor to be here. And thank you, Meghana.
Thank you, Lale.
And with that, we have closing remarks.
Yeah, that's up to me. So listen, Meghana and Lale, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I mean, intersectionality is such an important framework for us to understand as we take EDI work in engineering and beyond. I'm always intrigued by when you talk about intersectionality, there's usually a figure of two roads intersecting, but when you look at intersectionality, it's not two roads, it's 4 roads, 6 roads, 12 roads intersecting. And it really makes it a complex problem. And if there's anything that engineers are good at is trying to solve complex problems. And if there's anything we know, it's that the solution to complex problems are not simple solutions. So there's a lot of work for all of us to be doing in this area. And thank you so much for bringing to our attention some of the challenges that we can face when addressing it. And I was so glad, Meghana, that you pointed out the words of Audre Lorde that says there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So thank you once again for an excellent presentation. And I'd also like to mention that we just launched an EDI course for engineers and geoscientists today. In fact, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion EDI for Engineers and Geoscientists is an online course available on Engineers and Geoscientists British Columbia's New Knowledge Center. This self-paced 1-hour course is free to all engineers and geoscientists across Canada. And we've developed this course with guidance from the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Training Task Force, made up of representatives from the 30 by 30 Champions Network, the National Society of Black Engineers, Canadian chapters, National Sciences and Engineering Research Council, NSERC chairs for Women in Engineering, ENGIqueers Canada, and in partnerships with Engineers and Geoscientists BC, EGBC, and Geoscientists Canada. We hope that you all have a chance to take the course as part of your continuing education credits. So with that, I ask you to please join us next week for our final session of the 2022 conference. That's next Wednesday, April the 27th. We put the registration link in the chat if you haven't already signed up. And we'll be talking to 4 of our Engineers Canada EDI leader nominees and participating in a workshop on self-care for champions. So thank you very much and have a great day. And we look forward to seeing you all next week.